Hello everyone, Bag here. Mydei is coming in the second half of 3.1, meaning that if you are planning to go for him, thinking about how to build a team for him within your account is a pretty good idea. And hey, look at you, clicking on this video to do just that. You really are doing Mydei proud. Anyways, before we get into the list proper, let's first go over what Mydei generally needs from his teams. Mydei is a pretty standard hypercarry with not that many wants from any specific synergies to really get online. For what he does ask for, him scaling off of HP does mean that a lot of attack providing supports don't work as well with him as they normally would otherwise. On top of this, his charge bar mechanic where he works towards his extra enhanced skill by losing HP means that he wants to take as many turns as he can, since him consuming HP through his enhanced skill will lead to him expediting his own charging. And for the sustaining option, usually a carry looks for a sustain that also gives good offensive utility, but for Mydei, the main priority is just in that healing, as he needs someone who can keep up with his constant HP draining. While Mydei does have quirks in his kit that allows him to survive some lethal blows at low HP, it is still generally desirable to have him as healthy as possible, since he wants to have the ability to lose as much HP as he can, which he can't do if he has no HP to lose. His HP is a resource, and good healing ensures that that resource is being properly used. With all of that in mind, let's get into the actual tier list. Let's first cover the arguably most important team slot, the primary action advancer. The main options are Sunday, Sparkle, and Bronya, with RMC mostly just being used as a supplementary secondary action advancer instead. Well, to no one's surprise, Sunday reigns supreme as Mydei's best teammate, for a few reasons. For one, he is the only unit in the game that can properly support a -1 speed setup with Mydei while still keeping their buffs up on him in between turns. Mydei's largest hit is from his extra enhanced skill, but since this hit is procced by losing enough HP, it can happen at any point in the fight, so high uptime buffs help ensure that this big hit is properly supported. The usual struggle of a -1 speed setup with SP being very tight is also not that big of an issue with Mydei, since he does not consume skill points after entering his enhanced state, which also means that his other teammates are more free to be more liberal with their SP usage. This also means that Sunday is not as tied down to his own light cone to make the SP situation properly feasible, as is the case with using him with other carries like for example an S0 the Herda. Lastly, the energy gain from Sunday's ultimate is also a big deal for Mydei, as the ultimate also gives him a flat amount of charge to go towards his extra enhanced skill. This is also combined with the fact that a -1 speed setup leads to the carry generating more energy for themselves through taking double the amount of turns, so this just adds even more to their synergy. It's funny that Sunday does so much for him here, in spite of the fact that Mydei doesn't even have a summon, and so he doesn't even get the full buff from Sunday's skill. I wouldn't call Sunday a must-have teammate for him by any means, but he is the first one that I recommend to pair him with. Now talking about Sparkle, she does have a lot of similar strengths to Sunday here, but things don't align as perfectly for her. While her hyperspeed setup does allow for Mydei to deal more damage thanks to him using HP boots instead, generally, a -1 speed setup is still more optimal. If you are in an endgame scenario where the enemy just does absurd damage to Mydei, to where you don't need the extra turns to charge Mydei enough to get the required amount of extra enhanced skills, then the HP boots on Mydei might actually make a proper difference for him. But that is very fight dependent, which is not very in tune with the general tier list that we're looking at right now. Her buff does last until the start of Mydei's next turn however, so she is still able to buff him in the ways that he wants. Really, she has no weakness in her synergy with him, she just gives less than Sunday would in the same team slot. I would still call her an S tier teammate, but probably towards the bottom of this tier. Lastly, there is Bronya, and you might be able to guess her weaknesses from what we've already outlined. Her buffs will run out before Mydei's extra enhanced skill unless if it's activated during his action advanced turn, and her ultimate has an attack buff that is completely useless on him. And on top of this, her higher SP consumption means that the other supports on the team won't be able to spam their skills as much as they would otherwise be able to with Sunday or Sparkle. One note that I will add as a silver lining for her is that with an E2 Bronya, you could potentially run Mydei with HP boots while keeping him at above 133 speed thanks to her consistent speed boost. Doing this would firmly put her above Sparkle on this list, but it requires you to have 3 copies of Bronya, which not everyone has. By the way, if you are wondering if using 2 of these action advancers as both of his supports at the same time is a good idea, well, yes, it can work, but usually missing out on someone like RMC or Triby's potent buffing means that your attacks just won't hit as hard, especially when both of said units also have action advances of their own, at least if you count Triby using DDD. I am getting a bit ahead of myself though, so this seems like a good indication to move the list forward. Real quick pin here for me to say that you should maybe sub or something, I don't know. A Mydei guide is the next video on the docket, so stick around for that. Okay, back to the vid. Next, let's go over his sustaining options, which are pretty easy to go through. Luocha is his best option by a decent mileage. Yes, he has virtually zero offensive utility outside of manually applying Sacerdos, but raw healing is all that is needed from him here, and in that he excels. Gallagher is also a pretty solid option, with quid pro quo giving him some solid energy buffing. And there's also the fact that his healing works pretty well for Mydei, since it's based on the amount of enemies that get hit. In a -1 speed setup, he'll be blast attacking quite often, which then makes Gallagher's healing quite serviceable. The only downside to his healing is if you're using Mydei in an endgame content scenario with constantly cycling enemies, like in say Pure Fiction, since any downtime from Gallagher's ultimate debuff will pretty much kill his healing output. Still, he for sure gets the job done just fine. Linkshaw is basically the same as Gallagher here, just with less quid pro quo procs and more healing, and also the ability to avoid the ultimate debuff uptime problem that we just talked about with Gallagher. They are basically interchangeable on this list in most scenarios, so if you think Linkshaw should be above him, that's entirely fair. I should note with these two that one thing that Mydei does not want from his team is fast breaking, as broken enemies can't attack Mydei, especially if they get imprisoned. So against fire weak enemies, there might be some anti-synergy with how fast these two can break. Although for Gallagher specifically, this problem is only really a unique problem for him after you get his E6. It's nothing debilitating in terms of their synergy as healers, but it is something worth noting. Huohuo is a really odd unit, since while her attack buff from her ultimate is useless on Mydei, her energy is still very valuable, as we went over before with Sunday. I basically just see her as a slightly worse Linkshaw here, as while her utility is better, her healing is a bit worse. Still, she has every right to be called a good teammate for him, just not an amazing one by any means. From here on, we reach the tier of healers who might struggle more to keep up with him in terms of their healing. Lynx was a unit that I wanted to work really well with him, with her small HP buff and taunt with her skill, and while those are good, her healing is just not consistent enough to keep up with him, depending on how much the enemy attacks him. And the taunt is largely unneeded with his guaranteed taunt from his technique and ultimate. She's usable, but for cheap options, Gallagher is largely better. Bailu is the same here as she is in most comparisons, although here her lack of a cleanse isn't as big of a deal as normal since Mydei is immune to CC in his enhanced state, but her healing is just not that amazing for him, and she lacks a lot of the good synergy that Lynx has that would make up for that. Natasha is there as the best of neither world, not that good healing and no real synergy. Since Lynx is free and Gallagher was free in an event like 5 patches ago, I wouldn't really say that there's that much of a reason to use her here. And finally for sustains, we have every preservation unit. Obviously, Mydei wants to be hit, so taking aggro from him is bad, and he also wants healing, which none of them provide in any meaningful way. Fushuan might seem good with her HP buff, but again, she reduces the damage he takes, and she has middling healing, so I would generally recommend against this. Now, we reach the most abundant team slot in terms of options, being the sub-supporting teammate. First, there is Tribi, who is firmly in the S tier for this slot. The thing is, Tribi and Mydei don't really have that much synergy together, besides Tribi getting extra HP from him as an ally, but this kind of just plays into who Mydei is as a unit. There really isn't a single character in this game who really works well with Mydei's kit right now. What we have right now are just people who can support him well. No one has a Sunday Jingyuan type of relationship with him. Tribi is arguably the best generalist support in the game right now, and since a lot of the other generalist supports have some kind of anti-synergy with him that we'll touch on in a bit, she kind of just wins by default here. Obviously, with less than 5 enemies, her utility does face some issues, but in Mydei's ideal scenario of hitting 3 enemies, she will still do just fine. Tribi's generic universal buffing has, so far, not been the most important key to getting her into teams as a best in slot, but Mydei is one of those cases where that generic buffing is all that he asks for. Going off of what we talked about with Tribi, let's also just put every primarily attack scaling support in the bottom tier. Tingyun, Asta, Yukong, Hanya, and even Robin, well, they all do something for him, but generally there are much better, cheaper options here. Back at the top of the list, there is RMC. With such a non-demanding carry for specific buffs, true damage is really at its best possible position, alongside somewhat frequent action advances and the ability to spam skill points thanks to how SP flexible Mydei teams usually are. I would say right here that Mydei's best free-to-play team would be Mydei, RMC, Bronya, and Gallagher. And so everyone else below these options on the tier list don't really need to be discussed that thoroughly. Silverwolf has unremarkable single target debuffs that don't really work well with his blast attacks. Black Swan and Fugue just don't give enough raw debuffing here to make themselves more useful than RMC, and while Ranmei does have some pretty great buffs, her weakness break efficiency and her redelaying of the enemy when they are broken also makes breaking a lot more of a problem with her on the team, which makes her a bit hard to recommend in imaginary weak fights. Pela is in this weird in-between zone of having better debuffs than Black Swan and Fugue, especially with her being able to spam SP for her ultimate, and no anti-synergy like with Ranmei, but still worse overall than RMC. Jiaoshu then goes right above her as he usually does, for no other reason than just being a marginally better Pela in comps that don't specifically want his utility, which is most comps. So that brings us to our final topic of this video, Castorice. From here on out, things will be very speculative, as Castorice is only in her version 1 of her kit as this video is being produced. So not only will things change a good amount going forward, but theory crafting with her in general is also just in its beginning stages. If you want a full breakdown of Castorice's version 1 kit, I have a video that goes in depth into it. But otherwise, with all of that aside, how well do they work together as a dual DPS team? Well, the short answer is that they do work extremely well together, but there is a bit of a snag in teams in terms of obtaining their optimal team. For their synergies, Castorice both wants high HP teammates to accelerate her unique energy generation, while she also consumes a large portion of the team's HP with all of her turns, which Mydei obviously wants. She also doesn't consume SP either, which means that the usual SP problems of a dual DPS team is virtually non-existent between the two of them. Castorice also has some team-wide buffs, such as a 20% respen field when the dragon is alive, and a 10% damage increase for the whole team for 2 turns after the dragon spawns. These are some very strong synergies between them, so what's the catch? Well, on top of the usual downside of dual DPS teams, where each individual carry does a lot less damage due to the lack of supports for them, the one team slot for a support in this team is a bit odd to fill. Single target supports like RMC or Sunday don't spread their buffs evenly between the two of them, and those two are some of their best respective supports. Without those extra turns from action advancers, Mydei is consuming a lot less of his own HP through having less turns, which partially eats away at the extra HP consumption that comes from being paired with Castorice. And the same logic also goes with Castorice losing turns, since her HP consuming turns are important for keeping the dragon as healthy as possible, and for building towards summoning the dragon when it's not alive. Since we've already talked about why Robin and Ranmei are anti-synergistic, the only real options to buff the both of them are with debuffers like Pela or Jiaoshu, or Tribi. The problem with Tribi is that in order to get this team to work, you need to pull on 3 banners back to back to back, which is just not very recommendable for most players. This doesn't actually impact how good the team is on paper though, so it's hard to really factor that in on this tier list, but it is a roadblock that will likely stop this team comp from being too prominent without a couple reruns for each of these units. The other problem with this comp is just the inherent problem that comes with a dual element dual DPS team, as you ideally want to look out for enemies who are quantum weak and imaginary weak, which inherently limits the amount of use cases this duo has over their respective hypercarry teams. The good news for this comp is that for healers, Gallagher still performs incredibly well, since his healing is done through each character attacking, so having more high HP carries to heal doesn't actually increase the workload of his healing, like, at all. Right now, Castorice seems to be a very strong teammate, but getting their synergy properly online does require some not so free to play friendly options. So for the extra effort that the team comp requires, I'm willing to put her in the top of the A tier for now. So that's the list. Mydei is a pretty standard unit to build around, and while he is not quite at the same free-to-play accessibility level as the Herda, his cheap teams can still perform very well in their own right. He is thoroughly in the middle between the Herda and Aglaya in that regard. That's everything that I wanted to go over today. I will update this tier list in the pinned comment with any corrections or addendums, especially with how Castorice's kit will change going forward. So check that comment if this video has been out for a while. Make sure to subscribe for the Mydei guide that is coming out in the next week or two. Until then, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!